September 3, 1944, Le Mans, France, 9:14 a.m. A crowbar splits wood. The crate lid flies off and hits the concrete floor with a crack that echoes across the entire depot. Major Charles Dobbins looks down into the crate. Then he looks again. Then his hand reaches in and pulls out a Springfield Model 1903, a bolt-action rifle, 5 rounds per magazine, manufactured during the Wilson administration. Dobbins turns it over in his hands. The stock is scratched. The metal is cold. And somewhere 30 miles north of where he is standing, German machine gunners are waiting behind MG-42s that fire 1,200 rounds per minute. He drops the rifle back into the crate. He picks up another one. Same thing. He walks to the next crate. Same. The next. Same. Every single crate in that loading bay contains the same obsolete weapon, and his battalion of 800 men is scheduled to ship to the front line in 48 hours. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community, and let's explore history together. This is the story of a morning in 1944, when one man refused to accept a death sentence dressed up as a supply manifest. Before it was over, a 4-star general would drive his jeep through depot gates without stopping. An ordnance officer would lose everything he had built, and 800 soldiers would walk into battle with the right rifle in their hands. What happened in that depot would send shockwaves through the entire Allied supply system in France and force a reckoning with the kind of rot that thrives in the back offices of a war, hidden behind ledgers and classification codes, far from the sound of gunfire. By the summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had produced a military miracle and a logistical catastrophe simultaneously. The miracle was the speed. After weeks of brutal grinding combat in the hedgerows of northwestern France, General Patton's Third Army had punched through the German lines at Avranches and was now racing eastward at a pace that stunned even optimistic Allied planners. Entire German divisions were being encircled, bypassed, and destroyed. The map was changing by the hour. The catastrophe was everything required to sustain that speed: fuel, ammunition, replacement soldiers, replacement weapons. The supply lines that had been carefully constructed to feed a slow, methodical advance were now being stretched to their absolute breaking point to chase an army that had suddenly become a force of nature. Trucks ran day and night. The famous Red Ball Express, a convoy operation that would eventually involve over 6,000 vehicles, was consuming itself trying to keep pace with the advance. In this environment, the replacement depots scattered across liberated France became some of the most consequential places in the entire theater. These were the processing points where fresh soldiers shipped over from the United States received their weapons, their gear, and their final orders before being pushed forward into the grinding machinery of the front. The quality of what those men received at the depot determined whether they arrived at the line as effective combat soldiers or as casualties waiting to happen. The M1 Garand was the standard-issue rifle of the American infantryman in 1944, and it was by every measurable standard one of the finest combat rifles in the world. It was semi-automatic, meaning a trained soldier could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger before needing to reload. General Patton himself called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Against the German infantry weapons and the terrifying MG-42 machine gun, the Garand gave the American soldier a fighting chance in close-range engagements. It was not perfect. Nothing was. But it was the weapon a man needed in his hands when the shooting started. The Springfield Model 1903 was a different story. It was not a bad rifle in the absolute sense. It had served American soldiers well in the First World War. It was accurate. It was reliable. But it was a bolt-action weapon in a war that had moved far beyond bolt action. Every shot required the soldier to manually cycle the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. In the time a trained infantryman could fire 5 rounds from a Springfield, he could fire 30 from a Garand. Against an entrenched German position, equipped with automatic weapons, the difference was not a tactical disadvantage. It was a death sentence. The men waiting in this depot at Le Mans understood this. They had trained with the Garand stateside. They knew what they were supposed to have. And when the crates were cracked open that morning and the Springfields were revealed, the silence that fell over the loading bay was the silence of men doing mathematics in their heads and not liking the answer. The supply system that had produced this situation was not an accident. It was the product of something far more deliberate and far more corrosive than simple logistical failure. Across multiple depots in the theater, a pattern had emerged in the months following D-Day. Black units traveling through the replacement pipeline were being systematically issued secondary and salvaged equipment, while modern priority gear was being held back and allocated exclusively to white units. The justification, when anyone bothered to offer one, was couched in the language of classification codes, priority designations, and theater-specific allocation policies. The reality was something older and uglier than any of those bureaucratic terms could contain. The men who enforced this system rarely thought of themselves as doing anything wrong. They operated within frameworks they had inherited, maintained ledgers they had been handed, and applied policies they had been told were standard. The machinery of institutional discrimination is most effective precisely when the people running it have convinced themselves they are simply doing their jobs. Major Charles Dobbins had spent his entire military career navigating this machinery. He was 33 years old in September 1944, and he had been old enough to understand what the machinery was doing from the time he was a young man in Atlanta. He had grown up in a city where the rules of separation were written into the architecture of daily life, enforced not always by violence, but by the grinding accumulation of 1,000 small exclusions. He had learned early that the way to move through that world without being destroyed by it was to become so unambiguously competent that the machinery had to acknowledge you even when it resented doing so. He had pursued that path with a focus that left little room for anything else. He had studied tactics, logistics, and military history with the dedication of a man who understood that knowledge was the only currency that could not be confiscated. He had trained under commanders who respected competence, and under commanders who resented it when it appeared in the wrong face, and from all of them he had extracted something useful. By the time he received his command of the replacement battalion, he had built a unit that was by any objective measure ready for the front. His men were well-trained, well-disciplined, and motivated in the way that men are motivated when they are fighting to prove something to a country that has not yet decided to fully believe in them. What Dobbins had not fully anticipated, though he might have, was that the machinery would follow them all the way to France. That it would be waiting for them in Le Mans, sitting behind a clean desk in a pressed uniform, holding a pen over a ledger. Captain Wallace Reed was 34, and he ran his depot with the conviction of a man who had mistaken administrative authority for moral authority. He had come to France from New Jersey, and he had brought with him a worldview that sorted human beings into categories of worth. With the same breezy efficiency, he applied to sorting equipment into priority classifications. He maintained 2 separate inventory ledgers. He had built the system himself and was proud of it. In his mind, it was not discriminatory. It was organized. It was logical. It reflected the natural order of things as he understood them. When Dobbins walked into his office that morning, Reed did not look up from his desk. The sound of the requisition papers being placed on the edge of his workspace did not produce even a flicker of acknowledgement. He finished the line he was writing, capped his pen, and looked up with the expression of a man being interrupted by something considerably below his attention threshold. Dobbins stated his case with the measured precision of a man who had prepared his argument carefully and was determined not to let his anger make it for him. His battalion was infantry. They were 48 hours from front-line deployment. The weapons in the crates were WWI-era bolt-action rifles, wholly inadequate for the combat environment they were entering. The depot had M1 Garands in stock. He was requesting an immediate transfer of sufficient weapons to bring his unit up to standard issue specifications. Reed listened. Then he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student that the allocation list was finalized, that the Garands were designated A priority and Dobbins' battalion was not on the A priority list. that the Springfields were, in his assessment, perfectly adequate for the unit's requirements. Dobbins asked him to define adequate. Reed said the word again without defining it. Dobbins put both hands on the desk. He told Reed that adequate in the context of an infantry engagement against German automatic weapons was a word that would look very strange on a casualty report. He told him that in the hedgerows and tree lines north of Le Mans, the difference between a Garand and a Springfield was not a matter of preference. It was a matter of who came home. Reed stood up. He straightened his tunic. He told Dobbins that if he had a problem with theater logistics, he was welcome to take it up with regional command. He told him that in this office the allocation was final. He told him, and this was the moment when the administrative language finally dropped away entirely, that colored units received B priority gear. That it was policy, not a suggestion. Dobbins looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the office. He did not go to regional command. Regional command would take days, and his men had hours. He went to the field telephone, and he bypassed every intermediate layer of the chain of command between himself and the man he needed to reach. The message that went up the line was short and specific. It contained the depot designation, the unit designation, the nature of the equipment being issued, and the reason given by the issuing officer. It was factual, documented, and damning. It arrived on a desk in 3rd Army headquarters within 40 minutes. The man behind that desk read it once, stood up, and put on his helmet. The jeep came through the depot gates without slowing down. The guard at the post had approximately 2 seconds to recognize the 4 stars on the helmet before the vehicle was already past him and rolling toward the center of the yard. It stopped in a cloud of dust, and the man who stepped out of it was not the kind of man whose arrival required an announcement. The yard went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something changes in the air. Patton walked toward Reed's office with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply covering the distance required to do it. He went through the door. It clicked shut behind him. What happened in the next several minutes was witnessed only by the 2 men inside, but the result was visible to everyone in the yard. The door opened. MPs moved to the filing cabinets. Ledgers came out. Manifests came out. Every document Reed had used to build and maintain his 2-tier system was carried out into the center of the yard and deposited in the mud. Reed came out behind them, no longer behind his desk, no longer holding his pen, standing in the same mud as everyone else. Patton walked to the crates of Garands. He ordered them opened. He ordered them distributed 1 rifle at a time directly to the men of Dobbins' battalion. The soldiers moved through the line. Each man handed back a Springfield and received a Garand. The exchange was systematic, unhurried, and absolute. When the last weapon changed hands, Patton walked to the center of the yard, picked up a single Springfield from the pile, and set it down in the mud. He left it there. Dobbins stood with his battalion and watched all of it. He had made a phone call. 1 phone call up a chain of command he had bypassed because the official channel had already failed him. And it had worked. His men had the right weapons. They would go to the front with a fighting chance. Whether that chance would be enough was a question that only the next 48 hours could answer. But standing in that depot yard watching 800 men hold rifles that could actually keep them alive, Dobbins understood something clearly. The machinery could be broken. It required the right kind of force applied at the right point, and it could be broken. What he did not yet know, and what no one in that yard could have predicted, was that the battle waiting for his battalion in the days ahead would test everything those rifles and those men had to offer, and that the choices made in that depot yard were only the first in a series of decisions that would determine whether 800 soldiers survived to see 1945. The question of whether they did is exactly where we are going next. In Le Mans, on September 3, 1944, Major Charles Dobbins stood in a depot yard and watched 800 men receive the weapons they had always been owed. 1 phone call, 1 4-star general. 1 pile of Springfields left in the mud. It looked like a victory. And it was. But the battle inside the system was nowhere close to finished. Because what happened at Le Mans did not stay in Le Mans. Within 72 hours, a formal complaint had been filed against Dobbins through back channels authored by officers who had not been present at the depot, but who had a great deal invested in the administrative architecture that Patton had just torn apart. The complaint did not use the word discrimination. It used words like protocol violation, unauthorized escalation, and disruption of established allocation procedure. It was precise, legalistic, and entirely beside the point. And it landed on the desk of Brigadier General Harold Fitch, the senior logistics officer responsible for the replacement depots across the entire sector. Fitch was 51 years old. He had spent 23 years building systems, supply chains allocation frameworks, priority matrices, the entire invisible infrastructure that moved men and material from one point to another at scale. He believed in process, the way other men believed in scripture, and he resented interference with process the way other men resented heresy. He had not been at Le Mans. He had not seen the crates of Springfields. What he had seen was a report telling him that a junior officer had bypassed the established chain of command, triggered a theater-level intervention, and caused the unauthorized redistribution of equipment valued at over $40,000. He summoned Dobbins to his office on September 6th. The office was clean and cold, in the way that rear echelon offices were always clean and cold, untouched by the mud and noise that existed 30 miles north. Fitch sat behind a desk that held 3 neat stacks of paper and nothing else. He did not offer Dobbins a chair. "You went over the heads of every officer between yourself and General Patton," Fitch said. "You did not file a formal grievance. You did not request arbitration through the logistics review process. You made a phone call." "My men had 48 hours before deployment," Dobbins said. "The formal grievance process takes a minimum of 5 business days." "The process exists for a reason, Major. The process was being used to send my men to the front with bolt-action rifles from 1903. I chose my men." Fitch looked at him for a long moment. "You disrupted the operational integrity of a depot serving 14 separate units. You created a precedent that, if followed by every commander who disagrees with an allocation decision, would collapse the entire supply system in this theater. Or," Dobbins said, "it would stop the supply system from being used to kill American soldiers before the Germans get a chance to." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Fitch picked up a pen. "You are being formally cautioned, Major. A second incident of this nature will result in a recommendation for disciplinary review. The complaint against you will remain in your file. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You are dismissed." Dobbins walked out of the office. His file now had a formal caution in it. His men were already at the front with Garands in their hands. He understood the trade, and he had made it without hesitation. But what he also understood walking out of Fitch's building into the gray September morning was that the system had just told him clearly that it intended to survive. It had been interrupted. It had not been dismantled. And unless something changed at a structural level, the same allocation patterns would resume at every other depot in the sector with less visible victims and no 4-star general close enough to call. The something that changed arrived in the form of Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield, a logistics officer attached to Patton's 3rd Army staff, who had been quietly watching the Le Mans situation from the moment Dobbins' initial report came through. Whitfield was 40 years old, white, and from Ohio. He had a reputation for caring about one thing above all else: combat effectiveness. He did not particularly care about social architecture. He cared about whether units could fight when they reached the front, and the Le Mans incident had crystallized something he had been tracking in casualty data for 3 months. Black replacement units were arriving at the front, under-equipped at a rate that was statistically impossible to explain through random logistical variance alone. The pattern was systematic, and systematic patterns in casualty data were, to Whitfield's particular sensibility, a problem that demanded a solution. He found Dobbins on September 8th and presented a proposition. Whitfield had the authority to commission a formal audit of equipment allocation across 6 depots in the sector. The audit would document exactly what units were receiving, what equipment tracked against the standard issue specifications for their deployment role. If the data showed what both men believed it would show, Whitfield would take the results directly to 3rd Army Command and request a mandatory equalization policy covering all replacement units, regardless of racial composition. "One condition," Whitfield said. "You stay quiet. No more phone calls, no more direct escalations. Let the documentation do the work. If you become a visible agitator, they'll discredit the data by making the story about you." Dobbins understood. How long? 3 weeks for the audit. Another week to compile. Presentation to command by early October. "My men are at the front right now." "I know," Whitfield said. "That's why we do this right." The audit was conducted by Whitfield's team between September 10th and September 28th. They visited 6 depots. They photographed inventory ledgers. They cross-referenced issued equipment against deployment orders and standard Army specifications. The numbers when they came together were not surprising to either man, but they were devastating, in the way that documented evidence is devastating when it turns what everyone already knows into something that can be read aloud in a room full of officers. Across 6 depots, black replacement units had received M1 Garands at a rate of 31% of standard allocation. White units at the same depots in comparable deployment roles had received Garands at 94% of standard allocation. The gap was not logistics. The gap was not scarcity. Garand stockpiles at 2 of the 6 depots exceeded immediate demand by more than 400 units. The weapons existed. The decision not to issue them had been deliberate. Whitfield presented the findings to 3rd Army's Chief of Staff on October 4th. The room held 7 officers. Whitfield walked through the numbers without editorial comment. He placed the photographs of the ledgers on the table. He put the cross-referenced deployment data next to them. He let the arithmetic speak. The Chief of Staff looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at the men around it. "How many depots in the entire theater are operating on a similar model?" Whitfield said he estimated between 60 and 70%. "And the casualty correlation?" Whitfield had prepared for this question. He placed a final document on the table. Black infantry units in the sector equipped below standard specification were sustaining first contact casualties at a rate 2.3 times higher than comparable white units equipped to standard specification. The mathematics of the Springfield against the MG-42, played out across dozens of engagements, were visible in the casualty rolls. The directive came down on October 9th. All replacement units, regardless of designation, were to receive standard issue equipment per their deployment role. Depot commanders were required to certify compliance. Audit procedures were to be conducted quarterly. Violations would trigger immediate command review. It was not a perfect document. Compliance would be uneven. Some depot commanders would find ways to work around the language. Enforcement would depend on the willingness of officers at every level to apply pressure when they found violations. The system had a great deal of inertia, and inertia does not surrender to a single directive. But the directive existed. The data was in the file. The precedent had been set in writing by 3rd Army Command, and what 3rd Army Command put in writing had a way of becoming the standard that other commands eventually adopted. Dobbins received a copy of the directive at the front on October 11th. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. Then he went back to the work of keeping his battalion alive in the country north of Le Mans, where the autumn rain had turned the ground to mud, and the German resistance had stiffened considerably as the front approached the Reich's own borders. His men were fighting with Garands. They had been since September 3rd. In 6 weeks of combat, his battalion had engaged German forces in 14 separate engagements and had sustained casualties at a rate that his company commanders described cautiously as lower than expected given the intensity of contact. Whether that was attributable to training leadership terrain or the rifles in their hands was impossible to isolate. War does not offer controlled experiments, but the men who had carried Springfields out of training and Garands into France had their own opinion on the question. They did not discuss it in terms of statistics. They discussed it in the way soldiers discuss the things that keep them alive. Simply, directly, without much decoration. And then on October 14th, a signals intercept reached Whitfield's desk that changed the shape of everything that had happened since September. German intelligence had become aware of the audit. Not the contents. The existence. And they had begun to suspect, through whatever sources they had in the rear areas of the Allied advance, that a standardization of American infantry equipment was underway. They had started asking questions about what that meant for the defensive positions they were preparing along the Moselle. The Germans were paying attention. And when the Germans started paying attention to your logistics, the next thing they did was act on what they learned. What they were planning and what they had already set in motion by the time Whitfield read that intercept was something that neither Dobbins, nor Whitfield, nor anyone else in Third Army had anticipated. And it was coming directly for the sector where Dobbins' battalion was operating. The war that had started with a crowbar and a crate of obsolete rifles was about to enter its most dangerous chapter. By September 1944, Major Dobbins had secured the right weapons for his men. Then Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield had documented the systemic rot across 6 depots and forced a theater-wide directive. 800 soldiers went to the front with Garands instead of museum pieces. A formal audit created a paper record that command could not ignore. It looked from the inside like progress. Then the signal's intercept landed on Whitfield's desk. German intelligence knew the audit existed. They were watching the standardization. And on October 14th, they began to move. What happened next was not what anyone expected. Because the Germans did not simply adapt, they escalated. The intelligence that reached German 7th Army headquarters in mid-October 1944 was fragmentary but directionally clear. American replacement units that had previously been arriving at the front with bolt-action rifles units that German infantry commanders had learned to classify as manageable in close engagements were now arriving with semi-automatic weapons across the board. The tactical advantage German machine gun teams had relied on during the opening seconds of a firefight, the window between the American unit's first shot and its ability to sustain volume fire was closing. The German response was immediate and practical. Commanders along the Moselle sector issued revised contact protocols for engagements with American infantry. Units were instructed to initiate at longer ranges, using indirect fire to suppress before closing. Machine gun teams were repositioned further back from forward lines to reduce their exposure during the critical first contact window. Mortar allocation to forward platoons was increased by 30% in 3 divisions, facing the sector where Dobbins' battalion was operating. The numbers on the German side had already begun to shift before the tactical adjustments took effect. In the 6 weeks between September 3rd and October 14th, German infantry units in direct contact with properly equipped American replacement battalions reported first contact engagement losses running approximately 40% higher than the comparable period in August, when those same American units had been arriving with mixed or substandard equipment. The MG-42 was still a devastating weapon, but the window in which it was devastating without effective return fire had shortened considerably. German field commanders were not confused about the cause. Their after-action reports were explicit. The American rifle situation had changed. The implication was that the tactical assumptions underpinning their defensive planning along the Moselle needed to change with it. What the Germans could not fix, however, was the speed at which American units were now pressing their gains in the opening seconds of contact. The Garand's 8-round semi-automatic capacity meant that an American squad could put substantially more rounds into a German position in the first 15 seconds of an engagement than had been possible with bolt-action weapons. 15 seconds is an eternity in a close-range firefight. It is the difference between a German machine gun team completing its setup and dying before it can. But this was not the only pressure Dobbins and Whitfield were facing in October. Because inside the American command structure, the directive that Whitfield had forced through on October 9th was producing its own friction. 3 depot commanders in the sector filed formal objections to the equalization policy within 5 days of receiving it. Their objections were procedural on the surface, arguing that the directive disrupted established allocation workflows and created inventory management problems that would slow the entire replacement pipeline. Below the surface, the objections were exactly what they appeared to be: The men who had built and maintained the two-tier system did not want it dismantled, and they were willing to use every bureaucratic tool available to slow the dismantling. One of those tools was Dobbins himself. A formal complaint more detailed than the first was submitted to Fitch's office, arguing that Dobbins' original escalation to Patton had been the precipitating incident behind the audit, and that the audit had been conducted with a predetermined conclusion in mind, making its findings legally vulnerable to challenge. The complaint named Whitfield as a co-conspirator in what it characterized as a politically motivated interference with operational logistics. Fitch called Whitfield in on October 17th. The meeting was brief and not friendly. "The complaint has procedural merit," Fitch said. "If the audit methodology is successfully challenged, the directive loses its evidentiary foundation." "The methodology is sound," Whitfield said. 6 depots documented ledgers photographic evidence cross-referenced against deployment orders. There is nothing in that audit that doesn't hold up. The complaint argues selective site selection, that the 6 depots were chosen because they were known to show the pattern you were looking for. "I chose the 6 largest depots in the sector by throughput volume. The selection criteria are documented." "I know that," Fitch said. He was quiet for a moment. "The directive stands for now, but if this goes to a formal review board, it could take months. And during those months, enforcement will be uncertain." Whitfield left the meeting understanding that the directive's survival was not guaranteed. The system was fighting back in the only way bureaucratic systems know how to fight through process delay and procedural challenge. Every week the challenge dragged on was a week in which depot commanders could claim uncertainty about their compliance obligations and act accordingly. The event that changed the momentum arrived on October 22nd. Not in an office. On the ground. The Moselle River sector. October 22, 1944, 0630 hours. Dobbins' battalion, reinforced with 2 additional companies from a 2nd Black Replacement Unit that had come through the depot after the directive took effect, was tasked with taking and holding a crossing point near the village of Arnaville. The crossing was tactically significant because it anchored the right flank of a broader Third Army push eastward. If the crossing was lost, 2 American divisions would have their advance stalled and their supply lines exposed. The Germans knew it too. They had positioned 2 infantry companies and a heavy machine gun platoon on the eastern bank. The ground was flat, broken only by irrigation ditches and scattered tree lines. There was no element of surprise available. The crossing would be a direct assault across 200 meters of open ground against prepared positions. The battalion crossed at 0647. The MG-42s opened up at 150 meters. 2 men went down in the first 5 seconds. Dobbins' lead company hit the ground and returned fire immediately. Not a volley. Not a concentrated burst from a handful of automatic weapons, while everyone else worked their bolts. Every man with a Garand firing. 8 rounds each before the first reload. The fire volume coming from the American line in the first 20 seconds of that crossing was something the German machine gun teams had not calculated for. The MG-42 team on the left flank was suppressed within 30 seconds. Not destroyed. Suppressed. Pinned behind their own position by a volume of accurate semi-automatic fire that made raising their heads impossible. The team on the right flank kept firing, sweeping left. 3 more Americans went down. Dobbins pushed his 2nd company wide right, using the irrigation ditch as cover, closing the distance on the right flank position from an angle. At 60 meters, the 2nd company stood up and walked fire directly into the right flank machine gun position. The German crew had 6 seconds to respond before the range closed to the point where the Garand's semi-automatic advantage became absolute. 6 seconds was not enough. The right flank position went silent at 0658. 11 minutes after the crossing began, the left flank MG-42 team attempted to reorient. Dobbins' lead company was already across the ditch and inside the suppression angle. The German team had 2 choices. Neither was good. They chose withdrawal. By 7:12, the eastern bank was in American hands. The crossing at Arnaville was secured in 25 minutes of direct combat. German casualties on the eastern bank: 31, killed 14, captured 2 MG-42 positions destroyed. American casualties, 9 killed 22 wounded. Against a prepared defensive position with heavy automatic weapons, across 200 meters of open ground. The battalion's intelligence officer wrote in his after-action report that the volume and accuracy of American small arms fire during the initial crossing had visibly disrupted German crew-served weapon coordination in a way he had not observed in previous operations where replacement units had been equipped below standard. He noted it without further comment. The arithmetic was self-explanatory. The Arnaville crossing report reached Whitfield's desk on October 24th. He read the casualty comparison. He read the timeline. Then he walked it directly to the Chief of Staff's office and placed it on the table next to the formal complaint that was still working its way toward a review board. The Chief of Staff read both documents. He looked up. "The complaint is withdrawn," he said. "It was not a question." "Not yet," Whitfield said. "But this makes the case that the directive's enforcement is a combat effectiveness issue, not an administrative one. That changes which desk this belongs on." It took 4 days. The complaint was reclassified and routed to a different review authority, one that evaluated it against combat performance data rather than administrative procedure. Against the Arnaville numbers, against the 6-week casualty trend, against the depot audit, the procedural objections dissolved. The directive was confirmed permanent on October 28th. Mandatory compliance, quarterly audits, command accountability for violations. In the weeks that followed, the effect moved outward from the sector like a pressure wave. Other commands watching the Third Army data began requesting their own compliance reviews. By mid-November, the equalization policy had been adopted in 2 additional sectors. By December, it was the de facto standard across the European theater, formalized in a directive that made no reference to race, speaking only in the language of combat readiness and standard issue specifications. German intelligence noted the shift in American replacement unit performance in their November assessments. The assessment described a measurable increase in American infantry fire volume across multiple sectors and recommended accelerated development of defensive positions that reduced the effectiveness range of semi-automatic infantry weapons. The recommendation was tactically sound. It was also given the state of German manpower and material in November 1944 essentially impossible to implement at the required scale. The directive that had started with a crowbar and a crate of Springfields in Le Mans on September 3rd had by October 28th become standing policy for the most powerful military force in the European theater. 800 men had become a data point. A data point had become an audit. An audit had become a directive. A directive had become a standard. But the man who had made the phone call, who had stood in Fitch's office and taken the formal caution without flinching, who had led his battalion across the Moselle under MG-42 fire and brought most of them back, was not mentioned in any of the policy documents. His name appeared in the Arnaville after-action report, in the original complaint filed against him, and in the formal caution, still sitting in his personnel file. What happened to Charles Dobbins after the gun stopped is a story that almost no one ever told, and it is in many ways more important than everything that came before it. That story is where we go next. From a depot in Le Mans, where a crowbar split open a crate of obsolete rifles, to a theater-wide directive that changed how the most powerful army in the world equipped its soldiers. The story of Major Charles Dobbins and Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield had traveled further than either man could have anticipated when they stood in that muddy yard on September 3, 1944. The Arnaville crossing had proven the arithmetic in blood and minutes. The directive had been confirmed permanent. The system had been forced to change. But the question that no official document answered was the simplest one. What happened to the man who made the phone call? The answer is not the story most people expect, and that is precisely why it is worth telling. When the European War ended in May 1945, Charles Dobbins returned to the United States as a major, the same rank he had held when he walked into Captain Reed's office 8 months earlier. The Arnaville after-action report was in the files. The formal caution from General Fitch was also in the files. In the mathematics of the Army's promotion system, these 2 documents existed in the same folder, and the caution carried weight that the after-action report, however favorable, could not fully counterbalance within the time frame of the remaining war. He was not court-martialed. He was not publicly disciplined. He was also not promoted, not decorated for the Le Mans incident specifically, and not invited to the briefings where the equalization policy he had catalyzed was discussed as a logistics reform achievement. His name did not appear in the official accounts of how the October 9th directive came to exist. Those accounts credited the audit methodology and the chain of command review process. They were not technically wrong. They were simply incomplete in a way that was by 1945 entirely familiar to anyone who had been paying attention. He received a Bronze Star for the Arnaville Crossing, awarded through his divisional command. The citation described his leadership of the assault as demonstrating exceptional tactical judgment under direct fire. It was accurate, and it was the kind of recognition that exists in a file and does not follow a man home in any form he can point to. He accepted it without ceremony, shook the hand of the officer who presented it, and went back to work. When he came home to Atlanta in the summer of 1945, the city he returned to was recognizably the same city he had left. The architecture of daily exclusion that he had grown up navigating was intact. The men he had trained and led in France came home to that same architecture in Atlanta and Birmingham and Chicago and 100 other cities that had sent them to fight for a country that had not yet fully decided what they were owed in return. The tools of war had been equalized. The tools of peace had not. Dobbins taught for 31 years. He entered the Atlanta public school system in 1948 and retired in 1979. He taught history, which was either an irony or a form of deliberate reckoning, depending on how you read the man. He did not teach the Le Mans story in his classroom. He was not by any account from the people who knew him a man given to self-narration. What he taught was the mechanism of how decisions get made inside large institutions, why those institutions resist change, and what it costs the people inside them when the resistance succeeds. His students remembered him as precise, demanding, and unexpectedly patient with anyone who was willing to think carefully about a hard question. He died in 1988 at the age of 77. The obituary in the Atlanta Constitution described him as a veteran and educator. It did not mention Le Mans. It did not mention the depot. It did not mention the phone call or the Arnaville Crossing or the directive that his actions had set in motion. That information was in government archives cross-referenced across several document categories accessible to anyone willing to spend enough time looking. Almost no one was looking, but the legacy he left behind was not contained in any obituary. It was embedded in something that outlasted him by decades and reached places he never visited. The equalization directive that Whitfield forced through on October 9, 1944, did not end with the European theater. It became a reference document in the post-war restructuring of American military logistics policy. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, formally desegregating the United States Armed Forces, the implementation machinery that followed drew on the depot audit framework that Whitfield had developed. The audit methodology, the cross-referencing of issued equipment against deployment role specifications, the quarterly compliance review structure. All of it survived into the integration period and provided a template for how compliance could be measured rather than simply declared. During the Korean War, American infantry units operating under integrated command structures showed measurably more consistent equipment standardization than comparable units had shown in the European theater in 1944. The gap between what soldiers were supposed to receive and what they actually received had narrowed. Not disappeared. Narrowed. The work of narrowing it had begun in a depot yard in Le Mans with a crowbar and a crate of Springfields. The M1. Garand itself remained in American service through Korea and into the early years of the Vietnam era, eventually succeeded by the M14 and then the M16 as the tactical requirements of warfare continued to evolve. But the principle that Dobbins had fought for in that depot, that every soldier deploying into combat was entitled to the best available weapon, regardless of any characteristic except their deployment role, became a foundational assumption of American military equipment policy that no subsequent administration seriously challenged. By 1960, the idea that an American infantry unit might be deliberately issued inferior weapons based on the racial composition of that unit had become not merely illegal, but operationally unthinkable within the formal structure of the institution. The machinery that Reed had maintained so carefully in his pressed uniform had been replaced piece by piece with a different kind of machinery. Across 40 years of post-war American military operations, the equity principle embedded in that October 1944 directive saved a number of lives that cannot be calculated with precision, but can be estimated in direction and scale. Consistently equipped units sustain lower first contact casualties than inconsistently equipped units. That relationship holds across conflicts, across terrain types, across enemy capabilities. If the equipment gap that existed in September 1944 had persisted through the remainder of the European War alone, the casualty differential documented in Whitfield's audit, 2.3 times higher first contact losses for under-equipped units, applied to the tens of thousands of black soldiers who entered the European theater between October 1944 and May 1945, produces a number measured in hundreds of lives. Possibly more. The arithmetic is uncomfortable and inexact and necessary. The lesson embedded in that arithmetic is not primarily a lesson about rifles. It is a lesson about what happens when an institution allows its administrative systems to become tools of exclusion, and about what it costs to correct the damage once it has been done. The correction at Le Mans was rapid and visible, because a four-star general drove his jeep through a gate, and a junior officer was willing to make a phone call that put his career at risk. Most corrections do not happen that way. Most corrections happen the way Whitfield's audit happened, slowly, through documentation, through the accumulation of evidence that cannot be dismissed, through the patient construction of a case that forces an institution to look at what it has been doing in its own name. The history of military innovation is full of ideas that were called insane before they were called obvious. The tank was considered by cavalry traditionalists in 1916 as an unnecessary complication of straightforward infantry tactics. Radar was treated by several senior naval commanders in the 1930s as a solution in search of a problem. The aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the primary instrument of naval power only after a great deal of institutional resistance from officers whose entire professional identity was built around the battleship's supremacy. In each case, the idea survived not because institutions welcomed it, but because the cost of ignoring it eventually exceeded the cost of accepting it. Dobbins did not invent a weapon. He did not develop a tactical doctrine. What he did was force an institution to apply its own stated standards consistently, which turned out to be as difficult and as consequential as any technical innovation of the war. The rigidity of systems is not always about malice. Sometimes it is about inertia, about the comfort of familiarity, about the genuine difficulty of changing large organizations that have developed stable self-reinforcing patterns. But the result of that rigidity, whatever its cause, is paid for by the people at the bottom of the allocation chain, the people who receive the Springfields, while the Garands go to someone else. Now, the detail that almost no historical account of the Le Mans Depot incident includes, because it was buried in Patton's personal correspondence and not cross-referenced with the depot records, until a researcher working in the Patton archive in the early 1990s made the connection, is this. The single Springfield rifle that Patton dropped in the mud on September 3, 1944, was not left there. It was retrieved by a member of his staff after the general's jeep departed, cleaned and placed in a storage crate that traveled with 3rd Army headquarters for the remainder of the European campaign. After the war, the rifle was logged into surplus inventory with no special designation. It passed through several storage facilities over the following decade. In 1958, it was transferred along with a batch of other surplus weapons to a training facility in Georgia as part of an ROTC equipment allocation. The facility was Fort Valley State College, a historically black institution. The rifle was used in training exercises for approximately 4 years before being decommissioned and placed in the facility's small military history display, where it remained unlabeled and unidentified for decades. A military historian named Patricia Okafor, researching the post-war disposition of surplus weapons from Third Army, traced the rifle's serial number in 2003 and identified it with reasonable confidence as the weapon Patton had dropped in the mud at Le Mans. She published her findings in a small circulation journal focused on African American military history. The article generated modest attention in specialist circles and almost none elsewhere. The rifle remains at Fort Valley State. It sits in a case that now includes a brief description of its provenance. Most people who walk past it do not stop to read the card. The ones who do stop and read it tend to stand there for a moment longer than they expected to. From a crate of obsolete bolt-action rifles in a depot yard in Le Mans, to a theater-wide directive that formalized the principle of equal equipment for every soldier, regardless of race, to a policy framework that outlasted the war by decades and saved lives in conflicts that had not yet begun. Charles Dobbins proved that a single person willing to bypass a broken system at the right moment and to absorb the institutional cost of doing so can change the calculus for thousands of people who will never know his name. He did not receive a parade. He did not receive a promotion. He received 31 years of classrooms, a Bronze Star in a folder, and the knowledge that his men had crossed the Moselle with the right rifles in their hands. That knowledge, it turns out, was enough for him. Whether it is enough for the institution that made him fight for it is a question that every generation gets to answer for itself. The most dangerous enemy of a winning army is not always the man in the trench across the field. Sometimes it is the man in the office behind the lines who has decided with a pen and a ledger that some lives are worth less than others and that the machinery he maintains is simply the way things are. Charles Dobbins knew that was wrong. He picked up a phone and proved it.